There we go. Welcome, everyone. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that SPAO's facility, located in Ottawa, is on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We honor their long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory and uphold and uplift the voice and values of our host nation. We acknowledge the historical oppression of lands, cultures, and the original peoples in what we now know as Canada, and fervently believe the arts contribute to the healing and decolonizing journey we all share together. My name is Darren Pottie. I'm the co-curator of the exhibition Descendants. I'll be joined here with my other co-curator, Myriam and Cobb. And we're here to talk to three artists, Leila Fatimi, Farihah Aliyah Shah, and Kosisochukwu Nnebe from the current show Descendants. Descendants is a group exhibition exploring themes of identity and a sense of belonging that come from one's personal family history and inherited cultural traditions. Storytelling is prominent within the exhibition, whether it is through rediscovering past events, claiming space in the present for diasporic communities, or imagining potential future identities. The exhibition looks at concepts of memory keeping and explores the intentional or sometimes unintentional selection of which memories are preserved and which ones are left behind. The exploration of carefully crafted histories can unearth and inform a sense of place, or the way in which one's history is tied to the land and to each other. How does one grow new roots in relation to our stories, our communities, and our adopted lands? As I mentioned before, Descendants is co-curated by Myriam, Farah, Cobb, and myself, in consultation with a wide range of Canadian curators and artists from across the country. This deeply intimate exhibition invites visitors to reflect on their own lineage and how past impacts their present and influences the future. Other artists in the exhibition include Anana Rafa, Shanhua Catherine Dong, Christina Hajar, Danisha Nujim Palash, Kamisa Makoita, Chris Muntia, Ms. Ikariko. The exhibition has been running from May 20th and closes October 2nd. So we have about a week to see the show in person. We want to say a big thank you to funding and sponsors. So the Council for the Arts, the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21 in Halifax, the City of Ottawa, the Province of Ontario, the Ottawa Community Foundation, and Hoban Architecture. Farihah, Kosisochukwu, Leila, thank you so much for being here tonight. Can we just jump in and let's get started? Farihah, can you tell me a little bit about yourself, as well as your practice and the beautiful kind of outdoor installation from your project Billy Said Strange Fruit? I will pass it off to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Darren, is it all right if I go ahead and share screen as well? Yeah, awesome. All right, folks, bear with me 2 secs. Just let me know if you can see that okay. Wonderful, thank you. So my name is Farihah Aliyah Shah. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm originally from Western Canada. I spent about 7 years in Houston, Texas, and then my family relocated back to Canada, but this time to Ontario. And I currently reside in Bradford and spend my time kind of in equal parts between Bradford and Toronto. I'm going to hit the next slide, although I'll stay on this next slide for a while longer, and then I'll kind of talk about the work itself. So in terms of my background, it actually stems from human resources and dance. So my creative practice started out very much so from exploring ballet, and I was a violin player, and that was kind of my introduction to the arts while I was in Houston. And then as I got older, I had a real keen interest in humanities, and I kind of found myself studying human resources, very much interested in the motivations of, behind why people act, how they behave or socialize. And I started to kind of draw parallels between, how people function from a working perspective, how they present themselves, how they change their perception of themselves in an interview process and in other kind of circumstances, and then thinking about how we kind of change and socialize from a historical standpoint. What are the motivations? What are the things that kind of make people do the things that they do? So I went on after working some time in as a recruiter. I went and I studied photography and integrated media. I was really, really intrigued by the program integrated media kind of looking at not just the still image, but also the moving image, kind of the history of movement in that way and its relation to photography. And that kind of brought me to my studies to an end in 2016. So as a lens-based artist, my practice explores my body in relation to the history of photography, areas such as the male gaze or the colonial gaze as it pertains to identity formation, things about race and race relations, connectivity to land, and collective memory. And I guess for the purpose of this conversation, I'll kind of focus on my relationship to North America as a space, having lived both in Canada and in the US for a large part of my life. This is really what spurred some of the interest of the body of work that was produced called Strange Fruit. So I'll show you now some images of that. So Billy Said Strange Fruit was produced early in 2017. I think I spent a lot of time researching it in 2016, and then it kind of came to fruition in early 2017. I recall watching Nina Simone's documentary on Netflix, and something really stuck out to me as I watched that documentary. And I'll just read a quote from Nina herself. So an artist's duty, as far as I'm concerned, is to reflect the times. I think this is true of painters, sculptors, poets, musicians. As far as I'm concerned, it's their choice, but I choose to reflect the times and situations in which I find myself. I found myself really, really drawn to that quote as a reflection of like why I practice, how I practice, and in response to my times and the times, this piece is pretty poignant to that. So between, I would say, 2015 to 2017, perhaps so within that time space, I was really looking at the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement here in Canada. I was looking at my relation to other historical movements when it came to civil rights. My uncle was in the Black Panther Party. And again, growing up in Houston, I was very close to that history. I specifically was looking at the murder of Philando Castile in July of 2016, Alton Sterling in 2016 in Louisiana, Freddie Gray in 2015, and the shooting of Walter Scott in 2015, all unarmed Black men, in a variety of situations, whether they were running away from the police, walking away from police, in their vehicles, on the side of the road, these types of situations. I reflected on my experiences in the States, traveling throughout the South. As I mentioned before, my family spent a lot of time in Houston, Texas. And as I was in Houston, I used to drive with my dad and my family members to different parts of the States and look at how my body was treated, in relation to others. So that was really the beginning of thinking through how I was going to create a response to things that I was feeling during that time. So as I mentioned before, in terms of my practice, how I think about things, and I'll just flip through and show you folks some images of the work. I was thinking about, the history of photography and this idea of still life. The idea of life in general is really something that I think about all the time. Why are we here? What are we doing? What we're doing? Again, some of the things that I talked about off the top. And I looked at kind of the reverence for flora and fauna in the history of photography in relation to like the stark relation between, or the lack of representation that there were of positive representations of Black bodies. So that's kind of where the piece started from. It's traditionally paired with the words or the poem or the song Strange Fruit, which was originally written in 1937, thinking about and expressing, the dark history of lynching of Black bodies, particularly in the South. And I just thought of like the historical lynching of Black bodies, metaphorical speaking of lynching of Black bodies. And so those were things that were really kind of prominent in my mind as I was creating the series. And so here are some of those images from the series that are not, in the space in Ottawa. I believe there are only 4, if I remember correctly, that are in the exhibition. But the total amount of work, I believe, are 8 images. And so the series compares, pieces of my body in relation to flora and fauna, in relation to potted plants, in relation to succulent. Instead of calling my body parts. I call them Succulent 1 and 2, figure 1 and 2, asking folks to really, as you've elevated, the history of photography has elevated, these plants above the bodies of Black people. Can we see them now on the same playing field? So that was kind of the impetus of the work. And I really love that it's been paired in the garden space, because the original piece was, it had these framed 10 by 10 frames that had dirt inside, the same kind of soil that you see in the images here. And it was meant to be a memorial to think of like the bodies that have lost. I could kind of simply just leave it that way. And so to have this cycle of bloom and renewal and renewance, renewal that's happening with the work, I think it's really engaging. So yeah, I'm quite happy that you folks have curated it this way. I think it works really perfectly with that space. And I just wanted to show a few more images. Here I'm returning the gaze to the viewer, kind of playing with the soil. I've titled the piece on the left, Roots. Most of the work in this series is untitled, but it's Untitled Roots. And then yeah, this is the only image on the right where I'm returning the gaze to the viewer, where I'm truly asking folks to, humanize this body that you've now seen in parts. And this is the only kind of moment that it's kind of recognized as a whole. And some images of this, the work in the space. Thank you so much, Darren, for your documentation. Yeah, so I guess I'll leave it there, pass it on. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the history and a brief introduction. And you just had a show at the Stride Gallery as well, I believe. Is that still on, or is that finished now?
That is finished, and then that work came to Ontario in Barrie at the McLaren, and it showed there as well.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Kosisochukwu, likewise, could you tell me a little bit about yourself and your practice and your current project in the exhibition, which we kind of raced to get in the last minute. I'm really looking forward to hearing about you talk more about it for the audience.
Of course. So I'm just going to share my screen. I'm going to be working off of my website actually. And so my full name is Kosisochukwu Nnebe, which means as it pleases God in Igbo. And that's something I've been thinking about a lot more as my work really starts to contend with what it means to be someone who is part of the diaspora, the African diaspora, and wanting to reconnect with that ancestry and reconnect with that particular place. And so I have been creating work since about 2015, but started to transition to working with photography and working with installation as of 2017. And that was spurred by a desire to kind of go beyond the topics I had been talking to in my old work and really start to explore the process of racialization. And so I was born in Nigeria. I left Nigeria when I was 5 and moved to Canada and grew up in Gatineau. And growing up in Gatineau, I experienced a lot of internalized racism and essentially spent most of my life kind of navigating this reality of going from a place that is predominantly Black, that is basically entirely Black Nigeria, and coming to Canada, to Gatineau, and really starting to realize what it means to be Black, because Blackness is experienced in very, very different ways, depending on where one finds themselves. And so my predominant identity prior to moving to Canada had been one of being a Nigerian girl or an Igbo girl, and then having to face the reality of what Blackness means in Canada became this kind of motivating factor that pushed me towards art. And so I spent a lot of years trying to create positive representations of Blackness for myself, because I felt like I couldn't find those in Gatineau around me. And so a lot of my time was spent trying to create portraits of Black women. And what I realized very soon is that that was only starting to scratch at the surface of what was going on. And instead, I needed to focus on the process of racialization as described by Frantz Fanon in his book, Black Skin, White Masks. And so my art practice became really focused on really analyzing this process of racialization. And a lot of it was drawn from this kind of engagement with Frantz Fanon. And so a lot of the works have to do with these body parts, including in this image that you see here, because there's a chapter within that book, Black Skin, White Mask, the 5th chapter called The Lived Experience of the Black Man, that starts off with Fanon describing this moment where he's walking down the street and sees a little white boy, and the boy points at him and says, "Look, a Negro." And then Fanon describes this moment and what it feels like for him. And it's this violent moment of racialization where he's living his life as a subject and all of a sudden becomes this object for someone else. And it feels like his body is being torn apart and reconfigured. And so a lot of my work is that visualization of this tearing apart of the Black body and this reconfiguration in ways that are difficult to understand, but are reflective of the lived experience that results from this process of racialization. And so this was an exhibition in 2017 where I used photography for the first time. And it was a kind of going back and forth between this process of objectification that Fanon speaks to and this desire to find one's subjectivity, and not only subjectivity, but what Bell Hooks describes as a radical Black subjectivity. And so my work is constantly going back and forth between these alternative kind of ideas of Blackness rooted in subjectivity versus objectification. And so the next time I work with those themes is part of this installation in 2019 called I Want You to Know That I'm Hiding Something From You, Since What I Might Be Is Uncontainable. And you again see how I've gone from pieces in 2017 to this kind of expanded and exploded Black body that is surrounded or has at the center a light bulb that casts shadows of the body parts onto the wall. And so this piece was really about wanting to visualize for this potential for and gender a kind of spirit of kinship. And so the audio for this installation is audio from a documentary by Marlon Riggs. And the name of the documentary is Black is Black Inked. And it starts off with this chorus, this kind of call and response where he's singing with the choir, and it's this kind of examination of Blackness and belonging to Black community as something that is made possible through recognition of another person's Blackness in a way that creates a feeling of kinship, but also the kinds of limitations or the kinds of nuances that are involved with being part of a Black community. And so this piece really speaks to both kinds of gazes, the white gaze, but also the Black gaze, and the possibilities and kind of restrictions inherent in both. And of course, this is a very kind of interactive piece where you can have the shadows of the body parts literally cast onto your body and onto your clothes as a way of really involving you in that process of racialization. Another piece kind of looks at the other side. So I'm always going back and forth with not only objectification and subjectivity, but also hypervisibility and invisibility. And so whereas the other installation kind of spoke to this hypervisibility, this other side, the second element, speaks to this invisibility and trying to understand it from a different perspective. And so it really deals with the theories of Edouard Glissant and his notion of opacity, which for me became really influential from kind of transforming my experiences of invisibility growing up and helping me see that in a different light in terms of this desire not to be seen as a way of protecting yourself, protecting the unknowability of yourself, and what Glissant describes as this right to opacity. And so this becomes, in a way, a game of hide and seek, where the viewer is invited to kind of search for me because there's a hidden image in this exhibition, in this installation, that can only be seen from one position within the space, and that's from atop this podium that's actually fashioned after a slave auction block. And so the viewer doesn't know that, the participant doesn't know that, but when they step onto that podium, they're meant to really engage with the kind of perspectives and lived experience that would have been created by being in that position. And from that position, be able to look out onto the rest of the space in a way that allows you to see and access and perceive differently. And so from that position, there's hidden images and words. And the words here say, I have been withheld. And this is, again, this kind of engaging with what it means to withhold yourself, but also to be withheld. Being withheld being still a form of suppression, but also wanting to withhold yourself as a form of almost resistance. So my work is constantly kind of engaging with these very nuanced dynamics around Blackness and how much we want to reveal and how much we want to keep to ourselves. From there, I ended up doing a lot of work with on Black Indigenous solidarities based on my time curating an exhibition at the Carleton University Art Gallery in 2020 that brought together 8 Black and Indigenous women artists. And after curating that exhibition, I continued with that kind of line of thinking with this project with one of the artists in that exhibition, Catherine Takpani. And the work is really starting to look at Black Indigenous solidarities as one possibility for anti-colonial solidarities that help us transition away from focus on colonialism and coloniality and help us go back towards non-Western ways of knowing and being. And for me, one of the ways of doing that is through language. And so this piece is a video work that sees myself and Catherine attempting to speak to one another in our native languages, except that we can't because we've lost the ability to speak those languages as a result of colonial policies, both in Nigeria and in Canada. And in so doing, as we struggle to speak to one another and actually have to turn to parental figures that are in the space or on the phone. So my dad is in the space and it's shown in the video, and Catherine has a parental figure on the phone. Through our attempts to speak our language, you see the effects of colonialism, you see the violence, but you also see the possibility for a different future. So it's a piece that's also about different Black and Indigenous futurities in a way that brings us to a different kind of worldview. And so this work also triggered a kind of interest in reconnecting with my Nigerian kind of heritage. And so that becomes the starting point for the piece that is in Descendants. So when I was invited to be part of the show, I decided that I wanted to create a new work. And I had been thinking not only about what it means to be Nigerian, but more specifically about what it means to be Igbo. And so the piece with Catherine was me attempting to speak Igbo. And Igbo is the language of one of the main ethnic groups in Nigeria, the Igbo. And there is a history of violence and genocide in Nigeria that has to do with the Igbo. There was a civil war from 1967 to 1970, where as a result of British policies that created Nigeria, there was basically the coming together or the forced coming together of these different ethnic groups in a way that really tried to manipulate divisions that had already existed as a way of dividing and conquering. And so in 1967, there was a lot of violence towards the Igbo in the north of Nigeria, which prompted them to move south to their traditional homelands and to attempt to create a secessionist state, a new country called Biafra. And that country existed from 1967 to 1970. But unfortunately, as a result of blockades, as a result of the actions and the violence of the Nigerian state, which was supported by Britain and other countries, Biafra was only able to exist for those 3 years. And over the course of that period, millions of Igbo people died of starvation, including many children. And so that country no longer exists, and yet while I was trying to learn more about it and to learn more about that part of my family's history, my mom was a baby during the war, my father was about 9 years old. One of the things that I realized is that although the country doesn't exist, you can still find different kind of objects that speak to its existence. And so when a country wants to assert itself on the international stage as a sovereign country, as an independent country, it tends to do a couple of things. So you'll definitely have the creation of a flag, a national anthem, but also the creation of stamps. And so despite Biafra no longer existing, you can find stamps from the Biafran state and you can purchase those stamps. And in a way, it made me think about what it means to be a nation state, and what it means to have these kinds of symbols outlive the nation itself. And so what's particularly fascinating is that there were different stamps that were printed based on the different years of existence of Biafra. So the first stamps were very kind of low-key stamps in a way, and essentially were stamps, sorry, I'm just gonna try and find this other, give me 1 second. So the initial stamps were actually stamps that were printed out by the Nigerian state. And what the Biafran state did was to cross out the words Republic of Nigeria, and then with an ink stamp, put the words Sovereign Biafra. And that was the way of transitioning from being part of Nigeria to being its own sovereign state. And so for me, it felt like such a weird kind of process and way of asserting one's sovereignty if all that's needed is merely to cross out a couple of words and to print out new words and stamp them onto an existing kind of document or symbol of nationhood. And so I wanted to continue to play with that and to also trouble notions of belonging to a particular nation state. And so what I did is continue to edit this stamp and essentially insert photographs of my parents. And so this is a photograph of my mother, and this is a photograph of my father. And what I did is I asked them for flowers that represented home to them. And I included those flowers in the background of the stamps as a way of kind of speaking to a different sense of belonging, a belonging not to the Nigerian state, a belonging not to the Biafran state, but a belonging truly to family and to community. And as a way of kind of speaking to these overlapping notions of belonging, overlapping notions of nationhood and sovereignty, and also immigration, I inserted this kind of edited photo or edited stamp into a stamp that is printed and kind of legitimated by the Canadian state. And so what you have is 3 stamps in one that speak to different forms of nationality, but also to different forms of belonging, and really aim to question who we truly belong to, where we truly belong, and what it means to belong all together. And so I'll end there.
Thank you so much for sharing. You have another exhibition in Ottawa as well that deals with flags and nationhood, not so much nationhood, but it kind of touches on a few themes. Is that still on? Is that project still going? Yeah,
so that's at Central Art Garage. So I have a series of custom flags that really engage with still Black Indigenous solidarities and imperialism and language and belonging to land. And that one I think might still be on for another week. But yeah, thanks for flagging
that. Pun intended. Thank you. Thank you again. And all the way in Toronto, Leila, can you introduce yourself and give us a little bit of insight into everything you do, as well as the piece that is exhibiting Shadow Art 29 from the Wandering Veil series. Over to you.
Thank you, Darren. Hi, everyone. I just want to thank SPAO for inviting me to be part of this exhibition, as well as participating in this panel. And I also want to thank the first 2 panelists for an in-depth look at your practice. It was so inspiring and fascinating listening to what sort of brought you into photography and how you're using photography to explore the themes in your work. But my name is Leila Fatimi. I'm an artist and community arts worker based in Toronto. My work primarily stems from my own experiences as a veil-wearing Muslim woman. I think a lot of the reason why I have chosen to pursue photography started from being a hijab-wearing little girl during the time of 9/11 and experiencing a lot of racism and a lot of feelings of being misunderstood at that time. I experienced a lot of isolation just from one moment to the next. And so I actually, at that young age, took to photography as a hobby and really used it to sort of explore in my own time, just because I was feeling extremely lonely, extremely misunderstood. I felt that a lot of the images that I was seeing were really hard images for me to contend with. And so I just started creating my own narratives, which you can imagine a 10-year-old with a camera, what that would look like. Definitely not anything like my current work. And so that kind of started off my relationship with photography. But of course, as I got older and was more and more drawn to the medium, I decided to pursue my studies in photography at Toronto Metropolitan University. And I think it was during my studies there, particularly learning about art history and the era of Orientalism, both in photography and in art history, that I was really sort of curious about my identity in relationship to Western history of art and Western history of photography. And so I sort of turned my focus towards exploring myself in that way. And so the work in the exhibition is actually part of a series called The Wandering Veil, which was one of the very first works that I created. And I'm just gonna share my screen. Oh, can I get permission to share my screen? So I can aid with some visuals and you don't just have to look at me. Yeah, so The Wandering Veil was one of the first series that I created back in 2013 is when I started this project. It's an ongoing project, so I continue to shoot for it. But I think one of the real inspirations for me, or rather intentions in creating this work, was thinking about the veil from a spiritual perspective and not necessarily a political perspective, because the veil has been and continues to be so heavily politicized. I really wanted to think about my own relationship with it and my decision to put it on as a young girl and how it was so spiritually motivated, and thinking about embracing my religion, my community, and sort of likening myself to the practice of, or the practices that we find in Islam, one of them being wearing a veil. And now the veil that I chose to use in these images is called a chador, and it's a prayer veil. So it's a veil that we use when we're engaging in acts of worship and prayer. And so for me, in creating these images, I was really focused on making room for a conversation that was more about finding a sense of peace through wearing the veil, and thinking about how I could use landscape and nature to further reiterate that. I think personally, I find a lot of my own peace in nature, and that piece sort of mirrors itself in my own spiritual practices. And so thinking about a way to merge those two together is how the Wandering Veil came about. I also, in these images, which are self-portraits, so I am the subject as well as the photographer, I was thinking about the veil as sort of being like an entry point or a blank space for the viewer to insert themselves into the photos as well and see what may come up for them, or if they're also able to sort of connect to the imagery from a more spiritual perspective. So that was where I started my practice. As I mentioned, this is an ongoing project. So the work that is in the exhibition, which has actually not made it to my website yet, is one of the newer images that I just shot last year. And so my approach to making these images is really based off of the connection I feel to the landscape I'm shooting on. So I'll bring my camera pretty much everywhere I go if I know that I'm embarking on like an journey that is going to be primarily based in nature. And if I'm feeling those emotions or feelings of calmness and tranquility and feeling very connected to the earth and connected to my own spiritual experience, then I will create an image there. So there very often has been times where I didn't necessarily feel that connection, or I didn't feel that it was that impactful. And so I'll just sort of respect that feeling and not take those images. But more than half of the project was shot in and around Ontario. I think a lot of you would be surprised at some of the images that were actually shot around Ontario. And because that was where I started my project, it was actually really important for me to think about the environment of where I grew up and the natural landscape in that region. And then I sort of expanded it. And so now I don't have the same sort of like restriction to keep it within Ontario that I sort of started the project out with. So my entry into photography was really about thinking about the veil from a more personal and spiritual perspective, and adding that to the narrative and to the visuals that currently exist about the veil. But some of my more recent work is sort of a departure from this exploration. So the next project that I created was called Clothbound. As you can see, these images are very visually different than the Wandering Veil. Clothbound was really motivated from my frustration with a lack of representation of Muslim women, first and foremost. This project was created in 2014. So while we have made some level of progress in terms of general representation in media, there's still ways to go. And at this time, it was almost non-existent. Like, I don't feel I would see myself anywhere, but yet the places that I felt I was trying to be represented, it was always in a negative light. And so I was really frustrated with feeling like I was always painted with just one brushstroke. And this was a conversation that I was having with a lot of members of my community and a lot of young women my age who were feeling very similarly, how they felt like when they walked into a room, so many assumptions were already being made about them just based on their decision to wear the veil. And so I wanted to explore this kind of visually, but also subvert this idea. So I created a series of diptychs, which you can see on the screen. And in the first image, the fabric used in the background of the image is also used as a veil. And so it's meant to disguise the subject and sort of blend her in with the background. And for me, this represented the idea of feeling like all these ideas about me were already existing. And so I couldn't really be myself because people already had ideas of who I was before I even got a chance to express myself. And again, like, this was also conversations that I was having with a lot of women in my community. And then the second image, I really wanted to subvert that idea. And so I have the subjects looking directly at the camera and sort of disrupting the viewer with their gaze in an act of power. And I've also invited them to wrap the fabric in a way that they felt best represents the way that they wear the veil and individualize it. And then I also just invited them to wear something that they would typically wear and felt comfortable for them. And so there's this sort of like emergence happening, and I'm trying to use these tools of concealing and revealing to further highlight this idea. And so I would say this project was in a way sort of like a political statement that I felt I was making with it, which was kind of different from the way I was using photography to think about the veil as being something more spiritual. And then I'm working through the idea of using the veil as a political statement, as a lot of women do wear the veil as a political statement and as a spiritual commitment to themselves. And in researching the representation of Muslim women for this project, I became very informed in the history of Orientalism within photography as well as art history. And this sort of led into my more recent projects in which I'm not very often using the camera in the same way. I think with this project, specifically Clothbound, it was really important for me to also reclaim the position of photographer and work in a way with my subjects that they felt comfortable, which was very different from the historical use of photography and the colonial gaze on Muslim women. So that sort of led me into some research, which led me to this project, Revealed Revealed, which was my first time working with found imagery. So in this project, I haven't shot any of these images myself, but I have disrupted them. So the sort of story behind these images is that during the occupation of Algeria, there was a photographer, French photographer, Marc Geringer, and he was commissioned to go into the village in which they were situated in and take ID cards of all of the residents there. So women, children, men. And so he went out, he did his job, and he came back to his commissioner, and his commissioner told him that he needed to go back out and force the women to unveil because they shouldn't be wearing veils in these images. And so when I first saw this series of images, I had such a visceral reaction to seeing the expressions in the women's faces and their gestures, and just seeing how uncomfortable they were, how angry they were, how it felt like they were fully being taken advantage of and exploited for these images. And so my first inclination was wanting to restore a sense of anonymity back to the subjects. And so I did this digitally by recoding the images. So I found this archive, I saved all the images, and then I would export them as a text file and then go in and sort of just add my reflections on the images very candidly, almost like a diary, just sort of responding to how I felt about the images and, taking some code out, and then I would export it back as an image. So the coding would disrupt the images in this way. It was sort of a blind process. I couldn't really tell what the outcomes would be, but this is how they turned out. And so this sort of marked my first exploration into working with found images, and that led me into a more recent project called Disorienting Orientalism. And though I'm not using photography in this work, I am using found paintings. And this project is really focused on the history of Orientalism and the depiction of women from the Middle East and North African region, specifically the idea of harems and how they were fetishized in Orientalism. And it was a completely false narrative about how harems actually functioned in the region as women's quarters and family quarters. And so I wanted to disrupt this notion. And so I layered these paintings that I found, and I cut into them with Islamic patterns, which could be found in a lot of architecture. And among the conversations that I was trying to have with this work was the idea of Western Orientalism, which was all painted by mainly French and English painters. The majority of them, if not all of them, who did not have access to these spaces and were painting purely from a place of fantasy, and how this history is so predominant when we look at the canon of art history, and it's revered as being fine art, where when we look to the Islamic world and we look at some of their approaches to art, which oftentimes were without depicting people or people's forms, and more focused on calligraphy and sacred geometry and pattern. And that has always been deemed more secondary art and not within the realm of fine art. So I was thinking about incorporating that into the work and positioning this conversation about Western ascendancy and how it's inherently always seen as being more important than anywhere else in the world or any other histories. And so I did that through this. I'm just quickly going to, actually not here, show you a couple of images from some very new work that I've created, where I am going back to photography. Sorry, I feel like I'm probably over time. So this current series that I'm working on, which is called A Vessel to Bend Water, I'm again looking to the history of Orientalism, specifically working with postcards that I've collected over the last few years that depict these water carriers in the North African region. And this is part of the history of Orientalism in photography. And what I found really fascinating when I was collecting these postcards was the reoccurring theme of the water vessel, and how in almost all of the images, I would probably say like 80%, it was prevalent. And so I was thinking a lot about what it meant as a symbol and what it was there for with these images. And I will say, just going back to the actual images, they were intended to be ethnographic images and be considered factual, that these were snippets of everyday life. But in fact, all of the images were created in studios that were set up by various European studios that moved to North Africa and created these images. So again, they are all falsified. Oftentimes the models in these images were women that were hired to pose in this way. They were given props. And so I'm thinking a lot about how these poses and positioning is very repetitive, and the role of the water vessel in relationship to women's bodies, as well as the role of the water carrier being sort of like a lower class role, and referencing the region as being less advanced as Europe, when in fact, when these images were taken, there were much more advanced systems of water transportation. So I'm just going to stop there because I can talk about this project pretty extensively since I'm just in the thick of it right now, but perhaps it will come up in some later questions.
And this was shown kind of in part at Doris McCarthy. That's not still on, is it? Is that over, the show?
Yeah, it ended in June.
Okay.
And yeah, it was shown in part. So one iteration of it was shown there.
So we're going to look forward to seeing the whole thing in the very near future. Yes, hopefully.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. Okay. My co-curator Myriam has the next question for us.
The element of performance and self-representation can be found in each of your practices. Given the long exploitative history of photography, I'm curious to learn more about the way you approach performance, gesture, self-portraiture to your photo-based practice. Farihah, would you like to go first, or Leila? Whoever would like to go first.
Maybe Farihah, if you don't mind. I think I can give the audience a little break from my voice.
Sure, no problem. So I mentioned kind of off the top in terms of the beginning of my practice, starting from a dance base and root. So I think that's one element that kind of comes into my work, and I realize I haven't shown folks the rest of my repertoire. So if folks think I've only have this body of work, it's not the case. But a lot of the series that I explore often use my own body because I am positioning, my experiences next to the history of photography. So I think it's rather important for me to insert myself into that history. I also have access and I can afford myself a certain amount of agency. I don't have to ask somebody to pose in a particular way. I have the comfort level to kind of move in front of the camera, behind the camera. So those are the things that I'm working with as I'm creating. So yeah, my work comes from a very personal place. So using my body is quite essential to how I'm exploring this. The ideas of access and agency are also things that I'm looking at. What I choose to show in terms of my body, or in terms of historically how Black bodies are represented, you'll notice in my work, there are no hypersexualized images of my body. In some elements, it's almost androgynous. There might be images of my back. At one point, it was quite muscular. These days, not as much. But you have these kind of playing on ideas of what is femininity, what is masculinity, how has Black bodies and the idea of over masculine bodies been portrayed. And so there's this conversation that's happening with my body. So again, it's quite important for me to be able to use myself within the work. And it's quite calculated what I choose to reveal and what I choose to hide, when I choose to return the gaze and when I choose not to. Some earlier bodies of my work talk more so about, it's a reflection of my identity. So perhaps there's going to be more focus and elements on my hair, the texture of my hair, the shape of my face. And so those elements are more important. Whereas the piece that's shown in the exhibition here is really talking about a larger magnitude of Blackness. So it's less important to have features that are distinctive to me, if that makes sense. Until it comes to the very last image where I am returning the gaze and I'm asking you to kind of look at this body as a human being. There's also a really rich history in terms of feminist film and the history of moving image, where female identified folks who were in broaching and using film would kind of truncate their bodies and again, not look at the hypersexualized parts or remove that by showing parts of the body. So I'm using those kind of forms of history in the way that I photograph my body as well. So that's all over the place, but that's kind of what I'm thinking about and pertaining while it pertains to this question.
Thank you. Cozy, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. Similarly, I think that so much of my practice is kind of based on lived experience and is really based on this desire to kind of like search for this thing that Bell Hooks calls this radical Black subjectivity. And I think that notion of a radical Black subjectivity is something that has really been guiding me in terms of how I decide to depict and portray not only myself, but Blackness more generally. And so when Bell Hooks speaks of radical Black subjectivity, she's speaking of it in a way that tries to push back against this desire to, combat representations of Blackness that are negative, bad representations with good representations, because it's this constant tethering to whiteness. And so she's constantly pushing for something that pushes us beyond. And so she speaks of this kind of self-actualization and transcendence, and this kind of movement to forms of representation that kind of destabilize. And so as I represent myself and as I represent my body, I think of Blackness as that thing that can get us beyond to different understandings of the body, different understandings of humanity as well. And as I think of radical Black subjectivity, there is a figure that constantly is coming up more and more within my practice, which is that of the trickster. And in West African folklore, the trickster really comes up in different cultures, different ways, but in West African folklore and in Ghana in particular, it's represented by a spider. And so the trickster is really kind of interesting as an allusion to this idea of a radical Black subjectivity, because it's one that doesn't abide by binaries, right? A trickster is one that is basically a figure that teaches a community about morals by doing immoral things. And so it's constantly navigating these kind of worlds. So it's half between the human world and then the God world and so on. And I've been turning to the trickster as a way of kind of understanding myself differently. And so the work in a way is constantly this reconfiguration of the Black body in different ways. So when you think about the limbs that are pulled together again, one of the images that was hidden in the piece with the podium is actually an image of me in the form of a spider. So my body parts actually pulled together in the form of a spider. So it's representations of myself in ways that are kind of like inching towards non-Western epistemologies as well and non-Western cosmologies, because that's what the trickster represents. It represents a different way of understanding the universe that isn't so white and Black, but that really kind of exists within this fundamentally different understanding of morality, a fundamentally different understanding of spirituality and so on. And so the representations of Blackness and myself that I'm going towards are constantly inching beyond, closer to that radical Black subjectivity and away from kind of Western notions of representation as well.
Thank you. Leila?
Yeah, I think my relationship to photography, especially in these self-portraits and portraits that I create, is really tethered to the idea of reclamation and reclaiming a medium that was historically used to form narratives alternative to my own experience. And I think a lot about how historically we've been represented in ways that simplifies our identity into static consumable elements. And so I'm constantly trying to renegotiate that idea. And this conditioning that I sort of had growing up, that my representation was contingent on someone else's narrative. And so I really want to have a voice in that narrative, because so often our identities get pigeonholed by the expectation that we should perform what Western society thinks of us. And so the experience of myself, of other women of color, are often masked by a constructed perception of what our experiences should look like, which becomes a lot more complex when expectations of assimilation also occur alongside expectations of ethnic performance. So it really leaves us with these two options, which is to perform our ethnicity or perform whiteness. And so a lot of my practice draws on tools of subversion and using it to question this idea and to question the historical accuracy of what you are seeing being represented. So with self-portraiture specifically, I'm really considering my role as both the subject and the photographer, which allows me to be fully in control of how I want to be perceived and represented, and what story I want the images to tell and what story I'm trying to tell. So like I mentioned with the Wandering Veil, I was really keen on shifting the focus of the veil from being solely viewed as for its political nuances and exploring it through my own experience with a focus on peace, tranquility, and solitude. I also find that I'm my most immediate subject oftentimes, so photographing myself and documenting my relationship to the veil is also one of convenience. It's also important, I think, that I assert that this series that is in the exhibition is a visual exploration based on my own agency as a veil wearer. And so it's representative of my experience and not necessarily the experience of everyone who wears the veil. And like I mentioned, the idea behind creating sort of a blank space for the viewer to project themselves into was one that was meant to invite the viewer to think about what a spiritual experience could look like and what it could feel like. And I think this question was asked in the chat, so I'm just sort of also trying to address it while answering your question. So just to create an entry point that leaves a blank space for the viewer to insert themselves into the image and see what their relationship to it could be. I got some feedback from folks who have spent time with the series in various times over the last almost 10 years on what their experience was. So sometimes people are able to connect to it in that way and really see it as an invitation to do that. But sometimes that doesn't happen. So while that was the intention, sometimes it plays out differently.
Thank you. Thank you all.
I always admire photographic artists who work with self-portraiture, because there's often, I know a lot of photo-based artists that like to hide behind the camera and they like to control the setting, and they like to, there's a real kind of I'm behind here and I'm there, and I feel like there's a real kind of power in that vulnerability of putting yourself forward and kind of breaking that barrier that sometimes people can fall behind. So last question, and we'll open it up to the audience. The exhibition Descendants as a whole looks to inform a sense of place, the way in which one's history is tied to land and to each other. As first-generation artists and creators, I'm curious if you feel a heavily weighted responsibility in your arts practice to situate yourself between family, cultural tradition, adopted homelands on traditional territories, and how you kind of navigate those responsibilities to inform your creative vision. What are your, we've heard some inspirations, we've heard from Franz Fanon, Billy Said Strange Fruit, and from childhood memories as well. Do you feel restrained in any way, or do you feel a sense of responsibility towards anything that you, that may be stronger, I guess, yeah, that's the question. Faria, do you mind starting? It's a heavy, it's a loaded question, but see where you can go, take it. Yeah,
for sure. Sounds good. So earlier on in my practice, kind of at the beginning of my practice, I did feel the weight of this responsibility. And then I questioned that responsibility. Why is this responsibility being placed on my body, being placed on somebody as a visitable minority, being placed on as a Black woman, being placed as, this very intersectional body? Why is it that historically folks who tend to look like me or live on the margins are being asked this question? And so those are some things that I used to kind of ask myself to I guess release myself from this burden. One of the very first pieces that I ever did was called Prefix, and one of the images has the teacups kind of stacked on each other, and I'm kind of balancing these teacups on my hand, thinking about the weight of this question, the weight of my identity, the weight of my intersectionality, how it's always being questioned, and how others are not being questioned as equally. So these are some of the notions that I kind of work through on a day-to-day basis as I think about my practice, as it changes, as it morphs, and how I'd like to see myself kind of in the world, and how I'd like to challenge others to perhaps ask themselves that question if they've not been asked that question before, to perhaps feel a little bit of that weight and share the burden of questioning why we all are here. Most of us, perhaps in this room, are settlers to this space. So if you've never been asked that question, perhaps it's a really good time to embark on how you situate yourself within these spaces, and how we strive to collectively make, a more accessible or safer or whatever type of space for each other. So those are things that I'm continuing to kind of tackle within my practice. I wrote some notes because I really liked this question. I hope that my work kind of transcends speaking to perhaps only Black identified folks or the BIPOC community. I hope that it invites folks to, create a dialogue about their identities. I think my personal intent, as I kind of shared at the beginning of this talk, it was a choice of mine to examine how I am situated in this world, to perhaps push the question forward using photography and using art, and to use my work to create dialogue. So I think that's kind of where I'm at in terms of my reflective process of how I am as an individual, whether I am making work that speaks to, my immediate family, that speaks to something of generational trauma or joy or everything in between. I think for me, there are unresolved questions that I have that I try to use my practice to kind of answer and explore. And those questions are about kind of the holes in my history, whether it's because of, the historical movement of my family and why they have kind of existed in certain space. How have I ended up the way I am in terms of this biracial, multicultural body? How do I make sense of my own being in this space and how I interact and engage with others? How can I use my experience to both understand others, be sympathetic and empathetic, but also question not my existence, but I don't know, just question. I've got a lot of questions. I think I'm still kind of working through these questions every time I tackle a new body of work. So yeah, in terms of, I guess, how I move forward with a question like this, it's to understand that I don't necessarily need to take on that responsibility, that I should follow my curiosities as an artist. And perhaps I will make something that seems a little less heavy, a little less, let's use the term frivolous. Maybe this is something that feels lighter and is focused on aesthetic things. I think right now in my practice, I'm very much interested in having tough conversations and having them be accessible to a lot of people. And hopefully the hope is that, we can tackle some of these challenges that are persistent from capitalism, from colonization as a collective. So yes, I'll kind of start it off that way and pass it on to others.
That's a really well thought out response. I'm going to take a minute to process that. Thank you. Cozy, can also talk about this?
I'm still thinking about it. I wonder if Leila wants to take a crack and I can come afterwards. And thank you so much for your thoughts, Farah.
Yeah.
Okay, at first I need to say, Farihah, I resonated with so much of what you said. I actually don't know how much I can add to it, because I think you really nailed it with a lot of the ways that I was feeling, in terms of feeling that burden right at the beginning of my practice. And I think I often still feel a real responsibility to represent my community in a way that I don't think is necessarily my responsibility. But I think, like I mentioned in a lot of my earlier work, conversations that I was having with a lot of young Muslim women informed my practice in a really substantial way. I feel my practice right now is a little bit more focused on a research-based approach that is thinking a lot more about how historical inaccuracies have held the narrative in photography for so long, and thinking about how perhaps my work or my interventions can disrupt that and ultimately pose questions about those historic inaccuracies to contribute to a larger dialogue around, like Farihah mentioned, colonialism and its impact, really. So I think with my work, I really am trying to invite a reflective dialogue and having folks think about the themes in my work and their own relationship to it, or how their ideas maybe have been informed by said historical inaccuracies. So I take a lot of inspiration from researching the history of photography and thinking about how the medium can be used to weaponize, but also, again, going back to the idea of reclamation. And so in a way, I do feel it's my responsibility, since I am working with the medium, to assert that idea of reclamation and taking back a history that was told for me and not by me. I think, though, one thing that I want to touch on, specifically with the Wandering Veil, because it is so rooted in my relationship with the land. When I first started that project as a settler, I was very uninformed about the histories of the land that I was creating these images on. Like I mentioned, again, this was 10 years ago. So I hope as a person I've grown, and I think right now what I'm sort of thinking about is, rather than be thinking about how the land served me and its responsibilities, or my relationship to that idea of spirituality and kind of what landscape and nature does for me, is thinking about my responsibilities also as a settler to Indigenous communities, and ultimately the place that I call home. So this is something that I've sort of been contending with in the last few years, and wondering how I can have that conversation with this body of work. I think it's still a bit unresolved for me, and how I want to approach that and bring that into the work as it continues to develop. But it's definitely something I think, surprisingly, I haven't been asked yet about the Wandering Veil specifically. So it's just something that I'm sort of like working through and trying to derive inspiration from as well.
Okay. So yeah, I think with regard to this question, I was thinking about this just earlier today, actually. And so I was kind of pausing to think about a conversation I had with another racialized artist about how we are all talking about diaspora. And of course, that's really important, and that's the reality. But she was also saying that she had been invited to curate an exhibition and had been asked to curate about diaspora, even though that she wanted to talk about something else. And so there's this feeling that it's not merely that we're being driven by a desire to speak to these things, it's that there is a desire for us to speak to these issues on the part of an art world that hasn't created a lot of opportunities for us to speak and create work that extends beyond these topics at times. And I think that's important, because it's not just that racialized artists are pigeonholing themselves. It's that there's an art world that is kind of is only open in certain cases and in ways that benefit them, benefit those spaces when the conversations are topical. So as a Black artist, obviously you've been seeing this in a lot of different ways, particularly since 2020. And you see that in the pushback on the part of Black artists who are often tired of talking about Black pain. And there's been a movement to talk about Black joy, pleasure, and so on. And so there are ways in which we are pushing back and we are trying to speak to our experiences with a different grammar in a way. And I think that's really exciting. And so it's this kind of constant push and pull of wanting to talk about these issues because they are so top of mind to our lived reality. But that lived reality is not something that is of our creation. And I think often of Toni Morrison and what she says about racism being the ultimate distraction. The reason I'm focused on Blackness is not because I want to be focused on Blackness. The reason I'm focused on race and racism is not because those are the main things that kind of make me who I am. They're important, but I have to contend with them because I live in an anti-Black society. And so wanting to always turn the attention back on the system and not the individual as well. And I think that's why I gravitate towards not so much representations of Blackness per se in a way that, again, pivots towards positive representations, but what is that process by which I became Black? And what is that process by which, by being racialized as Black, I open myself or I have been opened up to particular forms of violence? And none of those things are things that are of my own doing. So I'm someone who's a policy analyst. That's my profession. I did my background is in economics. And so that desire to kind of go to the root of the issue and to understand the assumptions and to kind of tease away at the system is something that's very much in my practice. And increasingly, when I talk about colonialism, when I talk about coloniality, it's not necessarily to focus on those things and to focus on the harms, but to kind of want to jump over them. And so when I talked about that video work of me and my Inuk friend trying to speak to one another in our native languages, it's because we want to sideline English. We don't want to speak to one another in English. We want to dream of a future and a world where I speak Igbo fluently and she speaks Inuktitut fluently. And so there's always this kind of wanting to go towards a different future and to provide glimpses to a different future. When I speak about the trickster, when I speak about different forms of representations and understandings of Black subjectivity, it's because I don't want a subjectivity that is tethered to whiteness, to colonialism, and to all of those things. How can we understand Blackness as something that is ontologically so generative? Because Blackness, as much as it derives from this particular history of transatlantic slavery, offers us something. And so I'm constantly thinking about what is that knowledge that is being produced by virtue of being Black, of navigating the world as a Black person, because I think that we have such a distinct perspective on worldview and kind of knowledge that we are producing constantly. How do we create room and space for that? And how do we talk about it in a way that is generative, that sees in that a hint towards creating a different world, a hint towards seeing the failures of the world as it stands right now, and seeing Blackness not as a pathology constantly, right? Not as something that is always negative, as something that, and again, even moving beyond positive versus negative, Blackness is what it is because of things that happened, but what can we learn from it now? And how can that shape a different understanding of how we can come to be together? And it's the same thing with my focus on Black Indigenous solidarities and anti-colonial solidarities. How do we move away from all of those things and towards something different? And so there is something kind of future oriented in my practice, and something that's constantly looking for something I have a hard time articulating because it's new. And so that's exciting to me.
Thank you for all your detailed answers. You're giving us a lot to think about tonight. And now we're going to open the floor for audience questions. If you have a question, please, you can write it in the chat. We'll take a couple of questions tonight.
Hello, guys. I'm going to read, there are a couple of questions in the chat, which I will share. First off, Bruce is wondering if I know, Leila, you mentioned it specifically, but I think all of you could answer this question. He's wondering what is meant by the term Orientalism in terms of photography and what that can look like. If you can elaborate.
Sure. Sorry, I actually meant to define Orientalism, but got caught up in talking about other things. So Orientalism is a term that was coined by Edward Said to describe the West's ideology and tradition of misrepresentation of the East, and how it's been used in Western art, literature, and media. So I looked up the actual definitions. I'm just going to read it verbatim. So Orientalism is the representation of Asia, especially the Middle East, in a stereotyped way that is regarded as embodying a colonialist attitude. So as I mentioned, it made its way into art, literature, and media. So photography being one of those representative art forms, I guess. And so, yeah, the images that I'm using are from an archive of Orientalist photographs. So a huge source that I've been using is through the Getty Institute of Art, and they have an Orientalist archive. And so a lot of the images that you saw that I showed are from that specific archive. So I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you. There's another question here that is specifically for you, Leila, but anyone can jump in. I know you were speaking just briefly right now about your relationship with nature and landscape and reconciling some of that. A couple of people have noted that there's kind of a visual harmony between in Wandering Vale of the figure with the veil and the landscape that it walks through. We have someone named Alan who's wondering how you think that these images might also reinterpret the Canadian landscape. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
I'm curious to know more specifically what he means by reinterpreting the Canadian landscapes.
Well, I can speak to that if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry, my camera's not behaving itself. I'm not just white text, I promise. The patterns that you're showing us, you had at one point women hidden behind fabrics, and you were making them visible. Then you had the figure wandering in the landscape as well, and the attention obviously is on the figure and what the veil may say about the figure. But I wondered if you could turn the view around and wonder what the veil might also say about the landscape and what it might say to the viewer, having a veiled figure in some very almost stereotypical Canadian landscapes or wilderness-scapes.
Thank you so much, Alan, for elaborating on that. Well, I think asserting my existence into the Canadian landscapes was really also important, as much as it was about documenting what I perceived as sort of capturing a moment of reflection, a moment of worship. It is also very significantly about my body in Canada, in a Canadian landscape, and sort of speaking to this idea that like we are here, we are part of the Canadian, landscape, and creating that visibility through that veiled figure. So I think both of those things are sort of contending with each other in the images. It's meant to capture a very intimate moment, but also, yeah, I think going back to what I said about asserting and inserting myself into the Canadian landscape in sort of like a striking way, in a way that, as you mentioned, the viewer is drawn directly to the figure among the landscape as well. And I'm actually glad that you mentioned that there's some typical Canadian landscapes in there, because, sorry, I'm just going to anecdotally share a story. I was shooting on the Badlands, which is, there's an image of myself on these red rocks, and those are located just outside Caledon, which is about maybe 40 minutes outside of Toronto. And as I was taking those images, someone who was on the trail with me kind of commented and was like, "Oh, are you trying to make it look like back home?" And I was very taken back, like really wasn't sure how to respond to that question. And so that's something that like really stood out to me too. And also thinking about, first of all, what this person thought, where this person thought back home was, and why they thought that this would be a visual representation of it. So I hope that further answers your question, Alan.
It does. Thank you very much. And I know exactly where the Cheltenham Badlands are.
I think that's all the questions we have in the chat, Darren and Myriam. Pass it to you.
Okay. I think there's one just came in.
You're right. Yes. This one is from Liam for Faria. Says, what was the significance of choosing to depict a succulent?
For sure. So in the history of photography, I kind of looked at what images were prevalent within that history. I saw a lot of images very early on using cyanotype. For those who might not be aware, it's a historical process where you're using kind of, you're sensitizing a paper and then kind of doing placing either a plant or an object, something that doesn't move on this, piece of sensitized paper or material, and then it kind of leaves the shape or the image. So succulents were one of those plants that were used in that. And then I saw succulents kind of come up in other kind of landscape-based photography and still life-based photography. And so I kind of kept coming back to this image. So I chose succulents as one of the images that I would represent as this idea of flora and fauna that I saw represented in the history of photography.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you so much, artists, for sharing your thoughts. There's a couple things that are kind of bouncing around that I know that I'll be internalizing the next few days. Really poignant. As we leave, can you let me know where I can find more of your work? We saw some websites, so we know that they're there as well. But what's the best way to follow along and see what you're working on and what you're up to in the future? Faria, maybe you can start us off.
For sure. So you folks can follow along on my website. I try to keep it updated as best as possible. Some things will be shared on my Instagram as well. It's at Rihah, R-I-H-A-H, which is just my name without the F-A. It's what my baby cousin, who's not so much a baby anymore, used to call me. He couldn't pronounce my name when he was younger. So it's at Rihah. My work has shifted from Canada, or excuse me, it's still going to be in Canada, from Ontario. I have an upcoming exhibition in Calgary at the Contemporary Calgary, coming up in October, and then 2 back-to-back exhibitions in Florida, one in Tallahassee and the other in Miami, and then some more work coming down the pipeline. With my collective. I have an artist collective. It's a 2-person collective, myself, my friend and colleague, Alexandra Hong. Our collective is called Mastier Collective. So you'll also see that on Instagram. You can see that kind of linked on my Insta. In a year from now, perhaps. Right now I am resting, thinking about rest as a form of resistance. And so yes, things might be a little bit quiet for the time being, but you'll see more of me coming up soon.
Gosh, that sounds busy. I'm glad that you came up rest for a minute. Leila, can you tell us where we can find you?
Sure. My website, which is just my first and last name, leilafatemi.com. I also try to keep it relatively updated. I do have an Instagram account, and I'll just put that in the chat, but I am on a very extended social media break. So it's not currently being updated, but when I am back on, if I'm ever back on that app, I generally like to post behind the scenes and things that I'm working on. Right now, I am very much in production mode, so I don't have anything specific coming up just yet, but hopefully when I do, I can announce that on my Instagram.
Thanks so much. And Cozy as well, if you don't mind.
I'm just going to put my website and all of that in the chat. I am working on a couple of projects. I'm doing a commission with Mozilla Foundation, which runs Firefox. So I'm working on a digital project with them that we're meant to put online in March 2023, and then have an installation, hopefully in Amsterdam in June 2023. Working on everything else. It's kind of like, as an artist, there's so many things that are kind of in the pipeline, but you can't really announce because like you're waiting for curators to get back and confirm and all of that. So just working on a couple of things. If whenever they're ready to be announced, it's more on my Instagram, so I'll put that in as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you again, everyone. The exhibition is still on. It's on until Sunday, October 2nd. So there's still a little bit of time to see it, and you can see a lot of the web documentation as well as gallery hours and this recorded conversation at SPAO.ca/gallery. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and we will see you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.